Come, Spirit of the living God, and calm us and make us receptive. Give a word to our heart, inspire our thoughts and our words, and rain upon us, and be yourself our interior master as we open your word. We are part of something far greater, and so is the generation that we're in with regard to the history of the Church. It is, after all, essentially not just human, it is divine, and it remains that way. That should help us to relativize things sometimes. We do well to remember our origin. The origin, of course, we find already well testified to by the first generation. We have from the Apostle what he had already received. It comes in the first epistle of the Corinthians in some detail. What was handed on. Of course, he insists on this when he's writing to his beloved son Timothy later on in time. Guard the deposit. And so we have here the initial description, which of course is the essence of all Eucharistic rites we reproduce. I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you. The Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks. Now the translation back into Hebrew here uses the root of berachos for that, which is another study in itself. One, in that context, blesses, and that object over which the blessing is blessed. And goes on. But then it goes on also to the very doctrine. For that same apostle does talk about discerning the body. Therefore, it is quite clear in the earliest testimony that we have that it was understood as such. And that is the case right through the whole body of tradition that we have. The likes of Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus. And then we have this interesting case of the time of the persecution under Decius, around August the 12th, 258, just 2 days after Lawrence's martyrdom. Now, remember that Lawrence, next to the Pope, Sixtus, and the other deacons, they were caught in the act. And they were in, it would seem, an underground situation. Another congregation meeting for Mass in a crypt near the tomb of St. Chrysanthus and Daria on the first anniversary of their martyrdom. Now that's an interesting testimony in itself. And the words locum refrigeri in the canon is a hint, it would seem, of a even pre-Christian tradition of having some kind of bread and wine or whatever they had over the area or in memory of a departed soul. About which we have little historically reliable information. That's the martyrdom in question, but this bit is reliable. These were trapped by soldiers in the act and buried alive, avalanche of stones and sand, couldn't get out. So they were in there and died in there, in the act. When it became possible eventually to excavate the site, once the persecution had ceased, this was during the pontificate of Pope Damasus, 366 to 384, the skeletons of the martyrs were discovered. And they were in the positions they had been in. Men, women, and children, were found in their buried crypt, with the priests and deacons still holding the sacred vessels for the body and blood of Christ. This scene was on view for pilgrims to the catacombs through a window in a wall constructed there by Pope Damasus for more than 200 years. And not that far from where I live, there's a similar case in Ireland. There were holy, pious Catholics celebrating in secret, and eventually, years later, they were found buried in there with all the vestments. These then are our brethren, and we can be sure that when they were celebrating, they weren't concentrating in the first instance on the rubrics that they were following. They were occupied with the presence and also with the eventual joining of the Lord on the cross. And we know from the witness of the likes of Justin Martyr that the broad outlines were always the same. As time went on, they were diversified between East and West, as we know, the East being always tendentially more ornate, whereas a certain sobriety characterizes always the Western rite. But there are certain parts that are actually common to both. One of which, of course, is the fact that they were celebrating always ad orientem, or at least to a virtual orientem. And so that is just to be borne in mind, that whatever we do with regard to the physical orientation, the orientation of the soul has to be towards not other people. And by the way, in exorcism, I understand that that was one of the things that the old enemy of mankind gleefully admitted, that he had a great victory on that one. He pushed it. So, we have St. Cyril, precisely a witness from the East of Alexandria, although Alexandria actually would have a long link with Rome in church history because of St. Mark. So we have what he has to say, the great Cyril of Alexandria. If the poison of pride is swelling up in you, turn to the Eucharist, the word is already being used, and that bread, which is your God, clear, humbling and disguising himself. And if that's the case of our God, how horrid it is to the angels and to God himself when a priest uses the stage of the liturgy to draw attention to himself. Humbling and disguising himself will teach you humility. If the fever of selfish greed rages in you, feed on this bread, and you will learn generosity. If the cold wind of coveting withers you, hasten to the bread of angels, and charity will come to blossom in your heart. If you feel the itch of intemperance, nourish yourself with the flesh and blood of Christ. There we are, couldn't get more clear. Who practiced heroic self-control during his earthly life, and you will become temperate. If you are lazy and sluggish about spiritual things, strengthen yourself with this heavenly food, and you will grow fervent. Lastly, if you feel scorched by the fear of impurity, go to the banquet of the angels, and the spotless flesh of Christ will make you pure and chaste. This then is what we handle. It's as well to be aware of that this was, although occasionally put in some kind of question by the odd bod here and there, and in fact St. Norbert reacted against something which was not actually a denial of transubstantiation. It was a heresy linked with the fact of who and when was behind it. In other words, the question that he had to handle under this heresy of Tonchelin was that priests who were unworthy and in mortal sin, by that fact lost the power to consecrate, and therefore a consequence of that was that he was casting aside hosts consecrated by these unworthy priests. And St. Norbert is portrayed with a monstrance or a pyx in his hand, honouring the Blessed Sacrament, which he is retrieving because they are always validly consecrated, no matter what the state of soul of the priest. So even there, it's presuming, as a backdrop, the universal belief in the real presence. And of course, Luther himself, he tries to go around with all kinds of things like consubstantiation, but he did actually hit the table, you remember, est corpus meum. And around all the contestation we have then what happens as a result of his rebellion, that different shades of opinion come in. Calvin has the notion of the presence of Christ in the assembly, which is more or less what I was taught by my Sunday school teacher, and although he had a cryptic knowledge of the Catholic thing. That's another story again. But then, as time goes on, we get into the present Protestant view. The Anglican is a halfway house, and it doesn't really work for that motive. But when you get to the free churches, it's basically purely a symbol. Now, where am I going? I mentioned that bit. In recent times, what the Lord maybe has to say to those who, like that Protestant, would say it's only a symbol. And they would say, the Lord himself said, the flesh is of no avail. Now, this happened not that long ago in time. It was a Corpus Christi procession. It took place in Ghana, in West Africa, in the 1990s. A Protestant man saw this procession and he was horrified at this idolatry. And so he, being actually a very good professional at the whole art of photography and developing them, at least taking them very well, he was interested in photographs and he had good machinery. He decided to attack this by taking shots. This man took photographs of the monstrance with the intention to show it to some non-Catholic Christians as a proof that Catholics worship a wafer god. The man, who was a professional photographer, went to develop his photographs. At the photo lab, this came out. I'll show you in a minute. When he was given this outcome of the photograph, he first disputed with the guys at the photo lab, saying this wasn't one of his films. They calmly showed him his negatives containing the very image. And this is what came out in that Corpus Christi procession, aimed straight at the host. You can see it from where you are, I believe. It's not difficult to distinguish. There's no way that could be put on or just fabricated. Even Photoshop would have a job. And that didn't exist anyway in the same way in those days. So there we are. This is your God. And it's as well to be aware of that he has ways and means of getting through to us. When I was a student, first time round, doing classics, my best friend was studying in another university. I was in the University of Wales and he was in the University of Oxford, so I used to go visit him. And one weekend we went to a very high church monastery, Anglican, high Anglican, the convent of St. Mary the Virgin, because he had a chaplain friend there who was a good spiritual father. But we also got talking to one of the nuns, Sister Hilary, and she let us see the whole place and also provided some refreshment for us, and we talked calmly with her. So I could see that they were a very high church, a very good community, a beautiful monastery, Gothic style. And they were spending time in Eucharistic adoration, lots of it. And all the trimmings were there, incense and all that you might want. But one day, the Lord got through to them. And without any huge drama, he got through to the heart of each sister independently from the invalid host, and got them to understand it was in vain. So they opted to give up the whole heritage they had with this beautiful monastery, go over to Rome as a community, and to live the consequences. And so the Catholic Church gave them a poorer convent, but they've got Jesus, and that's all they want. The same thing happened in Wales in 1913. It's the only monastery in Wales. It's still there, called the Island, but it was a monastery which was in the Anglican Church in those days, Aylward Carlisle. And they were very high Anglican. They had all the trimmings, and they had one day a visitation from the Anglican Bishop of Oxford. So he looked at this and gave his written report that it was too Roman, this, and this, and this had to go, and so on. And the testimony which I've read of one of the brethren who was present at this event went like this. It was found in a choir book. At this point, Father Abbott, he went very quickly through the Mass that morning, which wasn't his custom, went into the sacristy, took off in haste his chasuble, made no thanksgiving, and summoned the community to chapter. We will now go into retreat, and separately we will consult the Holy Ghost. In a week's time we will discuss and decide on what to do. And the community came over. It became eventually Prynich, which founded Pluscaden and took over Farnborough from Solem. That's another story. But the Lord can get through to his own. Didn't stop there either, because the nuns opposite them on the mainland, St. Bride's, at the same time also came over. And they eventually went to North Wales, to Llacre, and they've gone now to Chester. But in the meantime, we have the development of the approach to the Holy Sacrifice, and we mustn't forget that, because especially, I suppose, in Holland, there is that tendency not to want to look too much at what some people would look at as an exaggeration in the Middle Ages. Well, is it? We know the way that the Cluniacs had an effect on Eucharistic development because they started ordaining ad missam. They had therefore a lot of altars, which also influenced church architecture. These little bits of protruding circular chapels emerge. Laron Abbey actually in Italy was like that. It was a French monastery, even built by a French architect. And the celebration of masses in the same church on different altars at the same time became a norm. The ordaining of all the choir monks became a norm. And so it developed into a whole church life, which took quite a long way from, one couldn't say, the simplicity of the early church. And it never happened in the East, for the simple reason that the East did not change so easily as the West with regard to simplification. Every celebration was given the maximum, basically, and that's still the case normally in the East to this day, whereas certain sobriety entered into the West and has stayed there. But, and we mustn't forget the but, there is a B-side to that but, and the Eastern Orthodox are somewhat scandalized by it. It's the fact that we sometimes forget what we're doing and are rather casual about it. And when it comes in Ireland, it's still there, unfortunately, but the large number of celebrations on a Sunday means that the celebrant has to go from one altar to the other. Therefore, the mentality of speed and efficacy comes into it. That's very different from what the early church had, which was maintained in the East, of a climactic, a very important event in the week. So we need to be aware that this also has to be addressed individually, that we mustn't get into mode of automatic pilot. It's always the maximum. But then we have the development spontaneously, which is already embryonically there in the Church Fathers. We know, for instance, of the way that St. Monica pleaded with Augustine to remember her at the altar. We have Augustine's writings also, which are read at this time in November. We have this reference to the sacrificial nature and the helping of people. So this was developing as time went on, and with the impetus of saints like Gregory the Great and on, we have things happening and reported. The 30 days of consecutive masses comes in at that time, and these visions accompany people being liberated, and that goes on, and it still goes on actually. We have, if one listens carefully, people coming back to us, little things happen. For instance, I've had quite a few testimonies, people coming to me that at one stage a close family member comes to them in a dream in trouble, then has masses offered, and then later on they come back in great light, another dream, that kind of thing. But then all kinds of things happen in between, and we mustn't ignore these either as though it is all to be dismissed. It's all part of our heritage. They're heirlooms coming down the centuries. We claim them. They're ours. It's our family. And the same Mass has the same effect. During the 17th century, a grieving girl approached an abbot. He was a Benedictine, Milan de Mirando, at the monastery of Our Lady of Montserrat. She begged the abbot to say 3 holy masses for her deceased father. The young girl was totally convinced that these masses would speed her father on his way to heaven, releasing him from the pains of purgatory. Moved by the girl's childlike faith, the abbot said the first Mass the next day. During this, the young girl was kneeling, and as she looked up, she saw her father near the altar where the priest was saying the Mass. She described her father as kneeling, surrounded by frightening flames, and located at the bottom step of the altar. The priest was alerted to this miraculous phenomenon, and he instructed the girl to place a piece of tissue where her father was kneeling. The tissue immediately caught fire, and everyone could see it. Though the priest could not see the child's father. Obviously, this represented his being purified by the flames of purgatory. A second Mass was said for the repose of her father's soul, and again the little girl saw her father. This time he was up a step, standing next to the deacon, and was dressed in a vibrantly coloured suit. At this stage her father was still in purgatory, but no longer touched by its flames. Now, that corresponds to what I said yesterday, these degrees, and that the final degree is this when there's no more pain of the senses, only that of desire. At the third Mass, she saw her father for the last time. During the Eucharistic celebration, he was dressed in a snow-white suit. But then, something extraordinary happened at the conclusion of the celebration. The little girl exclaimed, "There is my father, going away and rising into the sky!" She no longer had to worry about the soul of her father, as she knew with confidence he had reached the gates of heaven. This then is what we hold in our hand, and the power of the 2 mementos is something else. We need to remember, especially that when we're looking at the host, the consecrated host, at the second memento, when the Lord is truly present, that prayer, that naming of souls, has a huge power on the heart of our God. And I conclude with one little reflection that I picked up when given way back in France the life of the Abbot General Don Gabriel Sorte. He was Abbot General of the Trappists until 1963, and a very holy abbot. He was Abbot of Bellefontaine originally, and he was known to be very close to the Eucharistic Lord. He would gaze at the presence, and he is known to have said, and with insistence, je dirais qu'il n'y a rien qu'un prêtre puisse demander à la consécration qui n'est pas donnée. I say, and he insisted, je fais aucune exception, he said. Anything that a priest asks for at the moment of consecration is granted.